Hello, I'm Mogamat Kamedien. I'm a resident of Wynberg East at 26 Ottery Road. We are living here for the past 20 years in Wynberg. But the reason why we ended up in Wynberg was because my grandmother's grandchildren, they were attending schools here, and it was easier in terms of location or residence to live here within Wynberg, much more convenient since they were attending Wynberg Girls High School and the other granddaughter was attending John Graham in Plumstead. Yeah, my contribution to the oral history of Wynberg in general is with reference to the book that the local area historian Helen Robertson wrote, Wynberg, A Special Place. She makes reference to Wynberg in relation to Wynberg East, as well as the so-called colored community of Wynberg. I want to make bring to the attention of the viewers that Wynberg needs to be placed within the broader context of Cape Town and South Africa, and that is first of all the Dutch slave era, and then secondly the British segregation period, thirdly the nationalist separate development, also known popular as apartheid era, and then post 1994. That is the framework that I wish to have my discussion. Another dimension that I would like to bring to the attention of the viewers is that I'm looking at my talk from below the waterline or below the radar, and I think this is the purpose of the oral history, and that is to capture the narratives of Wynberg as we understand it, over and above that was formerly captured in the book Wynberg, A Special Place by Dr. Helen Robertson. She has done an excellent job to capture a portion of the history of Wynberg East, or the history of the so-called colored community. But I also have a few contributions to complement and supplement what Dr. Helen Robertson have put to us. Wynberg is normally associated with its British history. When Wynberg became a garrison town or a military town, and Wynberg is associated in a way during the British period and subsequent to the legacy of the British occupation and settlement in South Africa with Simonstown, because Simonstown became a British naval port as part of the British Empire, and Wynberg became a garrison town as part of the British Empire, or the British colony of the Cape of Good Hope in 1814 officially, but with the first and second British occupation, the British entered this space called Wynberg. However, I want to focus on the Dutch period. And the Dutch period is when Van Riebeeck came to start the settlement at the Cape. The purpose was to be a replenishment station and a refueling station. So already Wynberg became part and parcel of this expansion of the VOC by means of the oldest road in South Africa, which is now the M4. And this particular road was called the Old Vaarpad na die Bos. It started at the castle, it made its way to Woodstock, amongst others, by Observatory, Rondebosch, Claremont, ending up at Wynberg. And this was because at the time the VOC established buiteposte And these were very small working outposts or outstations of the VOC. So a very famous one is Newlands, which was that time Nieuweland, Rondebos, Grootskeer. These were all outstations or buitenposte of the VOC as it expanded across the peninsula. And Wynberg most likely was also part of that expansion of buitenposte, which was connected with the Waarpad na die bos. And this is very crucial because this road, as the oldest road of in Cape Town and South Africa, most likely took to Constantia Neck in order to get to Hout Bay, which was a forest. And that's why the word post is so important, because at the time the VOC not only had to supply food to the ships, they also had to supply, in terms of refueling, at least 40 wagon loads of wood to each of every ship that arrived at the Cape Town. Before their departure, they had to be refueled by means of at least 40 wagon loads, and 6 slaves were required to fill these wagons loads, or to load a wagon. So therefore, here in Wynberg, Witterbome is giving us part of that particular legacy, because these forests of the VOC was kind of what you would say nowadays Eskom generators. So this played a very valuable role. So Wynberg came into existence long before Constantia was opened up by Governor van der Stel. Interestingly enough, the 3 farms that made up the original area of Wynberg was Wynberg, the Wine Mountain, and then the other one was Vredehof, and the third one was Rust and Werk. These 3 historic farms were the first or the last outpost really before Constantia Valley was opened up by Governor van der Stel for new wine farmers or farmers to settle. So Wynberg is part of the Liesbeek River when the first Vryburgers or freeburgers were able to buy farms. So in this case, Johan Wegens was the first owner of Oude Wynberg, and Oude Wynberg eventually became the core of Wynberg settlement. This road, the Old Waarpad to the Bos, or the M5 as it is known now, also turned Wynberg into a halfway station, because it was midway between Simonstown and Cape Town. So when Governor van der Stel declared Simonstown to be an anchorage point for overwinter, that made Wynberg the midway or halfway station between Cape Town and Simonstown. And therefore this road continued to be important, and this road then became the Simonstown Road. The same M4 became then the Simonstown Road, connecting Wynberg with Simonstown, and the same road connecting Simonstown with all these other suburbs. And this was long before the railway line was constructed in the 1860s. Another dimension of the Dutch era is that, over and above the fact that the Vryburgers bought these 3 historic farms, what needs to be known that these Vryburgers, as well as the buitenposte, could only be operated and run with the presence of slave labor. So therefore, we as descendants of slaves finding ourselves in Wynberg have very long roots, and that starts already with these historic wine farms. similar to Constantia. Constantia wine estates that we see nowadays on the Constantia tourist wine route. We have a situation that people go and see all these fancy estate houses, but reference to the slaves that built these farms and planted the vineyards. Almost no mention are made of them. They are actually absent. And in terms of our oral history, we need to bring to the attention of the viewers that Wynberg didn't come into existence as a settlement, as a farming settlement, without imported labor from the four corners of the Indian Ocean. Be it Indonesia, present-day Indonesia, or the Malay Archipelago, or the Dutch East Indies, or India and Sri Lanka, that time known as Ceylon, or from Madagascar, or from the east coast of Africa, like Mozambique, that was a station for importation of slaves by the VOC. So from all across the Indian Ocean, our forebears ended up on these farms and later in workshops at the buitenposte. So it's very important that we need to bring to the attention of young learners that we have to look beyond these fancy houses and ask the question, who built them? Who planted these grape plants? So these wine estates and these buildings are still a testimony to the hard labor of our forebears, who was the enforced or the enslaved laborers at the time. Also very important in terms of the Dutch period, over and above slaves, there were also free blacks. And in Wynberg already in 1821, the Literary Gazette reported that the former slaves, there was a community of former slaves which the visitor reported were very happy people in Wynberg, which shows that there was already a very early free black community in Wynberg, and most likely former Malay slaves as a footprint of Wynberg in 1831 already. So what we had was at 1831 there was enslaved laborers on the farms of these wineland farms, and then also within Wynberg itself as an emerging town, there was also a free black community which later became known as the colored community of Wynberg. Yes, viewers, to come to the British period, Wynberg becomes very much prominent in terms of the British period. First of all, the British period was introduced, or the British period commenced in South Africa with the first English occupation, with the Battle of Muizenberg. And then afterwards, in 1804, if I remember correctly, the Battle of Blouberg, or led to the British taking control of the Cape and then becoming permanent. So this directly, both the first British occupation by means of the Battle of Muizenberg resulted in Wynberg becoming a military settlement by means of the military camp that the British established here, and that elevated Wynberg to prominence, because as a military town or as a garrison town, it is part and parcel of the British Empire. The result is that Wynberg as a town led to prominence over and above its neighboring towns, which originally were all buitenposten. So now the impact of this is that Wynberg had a connection with Simonstown, being a naval port. Then also Wynberg started to be transformed from a farming lands to a business or a service center for the British Army, which attracted businessmen and shopkeepers that serviced the military camp. So the military presence in Wynberg was a very big economic stimulus for this particular settlement or town, which resulted in its growth outstripping its neighboring original buitenposten like Clermont. Crucially to the British period was that slaves were emancipated under the British rule in 1834. All the laborers had to stay on the farms and in these wealthy estate homes until 1838, before they could physically see freedom. This, as I mentioned, resulted in the local former slave owners. While they were slave owners, they petitioned the government that there is a need to establish a magistrate's court here, a police station here, as well as a jail or a gaol, because their concern was that if the enslaved laborers become free, they will be roaming the towns and villages, and this will lead to disorderliness. So law and order was a concern to all the slave owners. So already in 1836, the local residents of Wynberg, as slave owners and property owners, they petitioned the government to do that. The result is they were successful, because the special magistrate as protector of slaves was then appointed in the 1840s to be a permanent resident magistrate, but his mandate was for the whole of the South Peninsula right up to Simonstown. So the magisterial district in Wynberg not just serviced the area of Wynberg, but the permanent magistrate had jurisdiction right up to Simonstown, including Constantia, because Constantia had numerous farms and they had large slave labor on those farms, and it was the state's duty in this particular area to monitor the labor conditions of these enslaved laborers. The result was, when the special protector was appointed as permanent magistrate, this served not just keeping the residents happy in terms of law and order, but my take on his presence was that it also added to former slaves coming to Wynberg to settle in Wynberg. So this led to immigration from the surrounding areas to Wynberg, where former slaves were directly under the protection of the colonial government in terms of its magistrate. But more so, it gave them confidence that they will be treated fairly and equally in front of the law. However, emancipation was fortunate for those that were skilled artisans. They were able to thrive, either gain employment in Wynberg or to make their own living. However, those former agricultural slaves that didn't have skills, some ended up in Wynberg unemployed and homeless. So the emancipation of slaves provided opportunities for those that were fortunate to have skills and those that were able to get gainful employment within this particular village of Wynberg. And they were able to do that because the military camp of the British provided economic growth and economic opportunities for those that directly serviced the military camp. However, the former slaves, they provided services to the general white population of Wynberg as property owners who were in some cases previously former slave owners. But the military camp was a stimulus for Wynberg and more people came to settle in Wynberg. One of the most important visitors for Wynberg during the early British period was the Indiamen, as they were called. These were mostly soldiers from India and from other military posts across the Indian Ocean that came on holidays here to Wynberg because Wynberg had a very good reputation as a health resort. So these Indiamen came here for decades to Wynberg to have their holidays, because if they stayed here for their holiday, they would get a full stipend as military officers and soldiers. But if they go to England and have their holidays there, then their stipend would be half. So it was very much profitable for the Indiamen, as they were known, to have their holidays at Wynberg, and at the same time to fraternize with the local military staff that were based at the military camp. However, that was one. All these historic farms then eventually were subdivided, and this brought more residents to Wynberg to settle down. One of the most historic opportunities that needs to be known to us is that a few fortunate free blacks were able to purchase portions of these farms. Now, at one stage, one of the big owners of the one farm were able to sell land. His widow was able to sell land. Mr. Betts his widow was able to sell land to three prominent free black families, amongst others Philip Rycliffe, also a Hendricks family, and then also the Falal family. They became early property owners below the main road, which was then known as Onderdorp, and above the main road was known as, on the hill was known as Boerdorp. So they got their own settlement here. The Rycliffes then had a big farm, Ouden Plaas, and this farm allowed them from the main road, cutting across the railway line in 1860, where a portion of the land had to be sold or made available for the construction of the railway line from Wynberg to Salt River. So they played a very pivotal role in the community. The Rycliffes also in the 1860s donated land for the construction of the oldest mosque in Wynberg itself. The Falals and the Rycliffes, over and above that, they were the earliest property owners. They also ended up being rentiers of having each 15 cottages that they later rented out. So the advantage they got of owning property enabled them to gain more wealth and to become more affluent. So both families were wealthy landlords at the end of the day, and even after the construction of the railway line in the 1860s, 1870s, the Falals had their own cab service at the railway station, which where they had a feeder taxi service, amongst others, to Constantia as well. So in a nutshell, the British placing the military camp here, which was basically to accommodate the Cape Corps, the coloured soldiers at the time. Some of the benefits was, amongst others, that the servicing of the local village economy allowed those traders in tailors and dressmakers and shoemakers, all these tradesmen from the coloured community, they were able to make a living within Wynberg. Testimony to that fact is that already in the 1840s, the government granted the Brody Road Cemetery, which is recognition that the local community played a productive role in the local economy of Wynberg. Yeah, dear viewers, Dr. Helen Robertson, in her book Wynberg, A Special Place, documents the diverse number of political formations such as the African People's Organization and the Non-European Unity Movement, who enjoyed strong support from the emerging professional class and particular teachers of Wynberg. Within this context of progressive education, the Wynberg 7 political trialist of Witboom High School is recalled in The Shaping of Youth. Ihsan Amley, a Wynberg 7 struggle hero, remembers that 33 years ago, on Monday, 8 June 1987, the Wynberg 7 was escorted to Paulsmoor maximum security by thousands of pupils, today known as learners, and leaders from various community organizations to start serving their prison sentences under the watchful eye of the apartheid police and security forces. Yeah, so that is one dimension that we need in Wynberg, is to honor the sacrifices of the youth of 76 and later, and especially in the 80s of the Wynberg youth, whereby 7 eventually under Disorderly Public Riot Assemblies Act were sentenced, and the community supported them and escorted them to Paulsmoor after they lost their appeal against their sentences. At the same time, we also need to remember the other political families of Wynberg, amongst others, the Jaffer family, as well as the Pandy sisters of the Pandy family of Wynberg. Our new millennial generation, they need to know about these struggle heroes and heroines that are not asking for any public recognition, but it's our duty as a community to recognize their contributions. However, as Dr. Alan Robertson mentioned, the New Unity Movement, as well as the African People's Organization, those are earlier political formations that contributed to the political awareness of Wynberg, and not just simply Wynberg. I recall from my own experience that my neighbor, Mr. Dawood Parker, at a corner of Ottery and Tyron Road, he was the secretary of the New Unity Movement, which was previously the Non-European Unity Movement, which became the New Unity Movement. He was the secretary of the New Unity Movement, and he was the librarian of the South Peninsula Fellowship, which was, in my understanding, of being an underground library of political literature, and many youth of Wynberg were educated by means of this particular community library, which Mr. Dawood Parker, the late Dawood Parker, was the librarian on behalf of the New Unity Movement. Also, Wynberg at the time also had prominent other political leaders that were residing in Wynberg, which gives Wynberg a very rich history. I recall immediately Dr. van der Ros and his family, who had to move from Constantia to Wynberg, as a very prominent member that was part of the founders of the Labour Party at the time. President Mandela gave him opportunity to be ambassador to Spain for South Africa, although he was a DA or Democratic Alliance backbencher. But when he asked President Mandela that he wants to do more than just sitting in Parliament, President Mandela arranged for DIRCO or Foreign Affairs to give him an ambassadorship to Spain. We also recall other residents of Wynberg, like Sissy Gould's brother-in-law, I think is Dr. Hamid Gould, who was a resident of Wynberg, as well as the famous Sali Dolly, who was also a prominent resident and a political figure within Wynberg. Then I also would like to recall that the Wynberg Civic, the current Wynberg Civic, is built on the shoulders of giants, and they very much forth against two things. One is that Wynberg not to be declared a group areas exclusively for colored residents, because Wynberg have always been a mixed area since the formation of or establishment of Wynberg East, as it's known now, or for that matter Lower Wynberg, which is below the main road and later below the railway line. So therefore the political leadership of Wynberg also consisted of sports leadership, also consisted of other prominent cultural leaders that made Wynberg a very rich environment and a place to live in. Dear viewers, I want to come to one of my last segments, and that is the era of the Nationalist Party with their separate development policy, which was amongst others known as apartheid, and one key piece of legislation was the Group Areas Act, whereby land across the country was then parceled up for exclusive occupation or ownership of one particular race in comparison with other racial groups in the country. Now, Wynberg itself was affected along the railway line with the implementation of the Group Areas Act. Wynberg East, as far as I know, there was 3 group areas proclamations for Wynberg East, which says that Wynberg itself, especially Wynberg East, was very complex, because why would there be 3 different proclamations dealing with Wynberg East as it is known nowadays post 1994. Wynberg East, just as Wynberg West, have been established as centers of worship and education. So therefore in Wynberg we have several mosques and churches, and we have numerous education schools, primary school and high school, and even at one stage a tertiary educational institution in Wynberg in terms of Batchwood Teacher Training College. And the result was that Wynberg have historically been a multi-faith, a multi-racial, a multi-ethnic, a multi-cultural place. However, with the group areas forced removals, Wynberg East ended up being declared or proclaimed solely for colored occupation and colored ownership. So the property rights of coloreds that have so-called coloreds that own properties here were marginally affected because the area was declared colored. However, when I came to Wynberg 20 years ago, my neighbor, Mr. Versteer in Tali Road, told me that his best friend in Tali Road, who was classified white, had to relocate from Wynberg. And Mr. Versteer, he was very sad and heartbroken when he told me that his best friend, as he had to help of his truck to take the man and his belongings out of Wynberg to Fishhoek. So that was my first direct encounter of the impact of group areas force removals in Wynberg. However, the Wynberg East, just like Wynberg at large, is historically a cosmopolitan village and a cosmopolitan town. So therefore, on the one side of Wynberg, along Witten Road, we have an area between Broad Road and Witten Road that was never declared coloured. It remained unproclaimed grey area because in Belper Road, several white families are still residing on that side of Wynberg East. So it is always interesting for commuters getting off the train to see young white children getting off the train, and they're very puzzled. Why are they not going up to Wynberg West or to Upper Wynberg or to the Wynberg Hill, but they walk with them in the same subway going towards where the mosque is and where the other business spaces are in Moss Lane, not Moss Lane, Beck's Hill, etc., and Broad Road to get to their homes. So post 94, this is very much perplexing to those that are not aware that not the whole of Wynberg was declared coloured, but that a certain strip remained unproclaimed, or for that matter, grey. So that is one of the ironies of group areas force removals. However, I also wish to bring to the attention that the group areas implementation led to many people that were displaced in Simonstown, Claremont, and other areas. They found their way very late in their lives to buy houses and settle down in Wynberg. So one that I wish to bring to your attention is the late Imam Amin Baker, who was a lifetime resident of Simonstown, but because of forced removals very late in his life, he had to purchase a house in Essex Street in Wynberg and to settle down here on basically his retirement after being a prominent educationist of Simonstown, being the school's principal of the Simonstown Muslim Primary School. He is also known as the first and only translator of the Quran into Afrikaans. So here again, Wynberg had prominent leaders in the educational field, and I wish to honor Sheikh Amin Baker, not just being the translator of the Holy Quran, translating it into Afrikaans, but in 1959 he gave a testimony to the Group Areas Board. He addressed the Group Areas Board in 1959 with these words: "I will lose my birthright. My ancestors were the first people to settle in this area," meaning Simonstown. "If I move to Bonteheuwel, I will become nothing, merely a number. They have no hospitals, they have no police station, no church, no school. A man can be subjected to such a disintegration that he will lose his spirit." Despite his appeal, despite his petition to to the group areas board members. The proclamation of the Group Areas Act in 1967 still declared Simonstown to be an area exclusively for whites. The result was the majority of Simonstown went to Slankop or Ocean View, which is very ironical. I really thought when I went to Ocean View for the first time, I will be able to view the ocean. And to my surprise and shock, it wasn't so. So this is the late Armin Baker. It needs to be known. He was not just an educationist and a community leader, but he was a serious representative of his community that resisted the implementation of group areas, the act, the implementation, and he became a victim of that legislation, although he was the only Muslim that translated the Quran in Afrikaans in order to promote common understanding amongst the various race groups of the country. And the apartheid legislation said it was all about racial harmony, not to cause conflict. But this man, Imam Armin Baker, late in his life after he retired as an educationist, had to make a new life in Wynberg. To elaborate on the impact of group areas force removals in Wynberg, Wynberg have historically knew a distinction between Upper Wynberg, Lower Wynberg. Lower and Upper Wynberg was known as Boerdorp, Onderdorp. Wynberg East was also known to be a very self-sustained community due to the legacy of British segregation, because in the 1800s our community, just like our generation, didn't really have the vote. We didn't have representation in the chambers of power where decisions were made about our life. So Wynberg itself had a village management board or village council consisting of property owners who were all classified white, and the residents largely that were colored very few qualified to vote. The result was that many things that was being implemented as public works programs were implemented in Upper Wynberg or Boerdorp, but due to financial constraints, those improvements like street lighting, water supply, etc., came to Wynberg, Lower Wynberg, very much late. So Wynberg have always learned to do things for themselves because the lack of state support. And this goes right to the start of education. When the colonial state didn't want to take up the responsibility of educating non-Europeans, the churches from the start had to ensure that colored children get access to education by means of building mission schools. Like Ottery in 1895, when this Ottery Methodist Church was rebuilt, the Ottery Mission School was built in Ottery Road. Same with the Muslim community, because the state didn't see its way clear to provide equal education, or because in 1921, or in the 1920s, probably 1921, the Cape School Board took it upon itself that it's only compulsory for white children to attend school, but non-white children, it wasn't compulsory. On top, the schools were fee-paying schools, and very few of the colored community at the time had the means and to send their children to school. So therefore, the churches had to continue taking the responsibility of providing elementary education to colored pupils. That is the one. In terms of these particular labels that we have of Upper and Lower Wynberg, Boerdorp, Onderdorp, but with the implementation of apartheid, race-based apartheid legislation, the railway line that was just separated the upper Wynberg from Lower Wynberg became an instrument of legal policy. The railway line then became the boundary for Lower Wynberg to become a colored majority area. Furthermore, in terms of the apartheid era, is that there is a legacy signboard in the main road which says Witte Bome. When you enter Wynberg East, nobody in Wynberg can tell you where is Witte Bome. They can direct you to Witte Bome railway station, and they can direct you to the Wynberg Civic Center, which used to be known as Witte Bome Civic Center, at the bottom of Rossmith Avenue. However, Wynberg in all likelihood remained a colored area due to the civics, the Wynberg East Civic Association, that took the group areas board to court to resist this particular racial occupation of exclusively a colored area. Their contributions of the leadership of the Wynberg Civic needs to be remembered at the time. There's also my particular understanding and interpretation, of which I don't have any evidence to support my interpretation. I also believe why that Dominee David Botha, who was the moderator of the NG Kerk, Sendingkerk, as the moderator of the Dutch Reform Mission Church, that he might have played a role in ensuring that Wynberg was not uprooted from its majority residents, because in all likelihood the Dutch Reformed Church, as well as all the other churches, owned large parts of Wynberg East, and therefore that particular institutional ownership of land in Wynberg East or Lower Wynberg may have also played a role in the decision that Wynberg remained for colored occupation. What is also important to remember is that prospective coloured homeowners never succeeded to get bonds from the building societies and other banking institutions, and therefore the Moravian Church of Wynberg East bought large plots of land around the church, which they developed into cottages which their congregants were able to occupy, and hopefully they may have also, like the other churches in other areas, they may have stood as collateral warranty that's allowed coloured ownership eventually. So not as far as I know, not a single coloured owner would on their own succeed to get a home loan unless they were members of some of these mission churches, and these mission churches stood in as collateral warranty for them to qualify for home loans. So therefore the church not just played a big role in the spiritual life of the residents and in the education of their children, but in all likelihood the church have played a pivotal role that made sure that residents, if they were not allowed to be property owners or land owners, they at least have remained long-standing residents of Wynberg, or as families being tenants for generations residing in Wynberg. Lower Wynberg, or as it's now called, Wynberg East, also had several other names such as Batchwood and Sussex Place, and Plumstead, because that was the house of Mr. Batch, who died where Batchwood Park is nowadays. He's also was buried there. So Wynberg had several names, and one Pacific one is Batchwood, and there is still a small remnant piece of forest in Castletown Road, because Wynberg was a very woody place. Ottery Church and Ottery Mission School were actually built on government plantation ground, which also confirms that Wynberg, not just Upper Wynberg but also Lower Wynberg, was part and parcel, similar to Constantia, was a very forestry place. And the VOC, in terms of the buitenposte, which was manned by VOC soldiers and VOC company slaves. One important buitenpost was, for instance, Nieuweland, and I think that was for a particular government forest at that particular point. Witterbome Station and the former Witterbome Civic Centre is also reminders of the need for wood that the VOC needed as a refueling station to provide at least 40 wagon loads of wood to the passing fleets of the VOC. However, I would say these forest posts were actually what we would nowadays say Eskom power generators, because wood was needed on a daily basis, over and above the 40 wagon loads that normally went to ships, so that ships can be in a position to depart. The local castle and VOC company officials as well as the ordinary householders had the need for wood. So the woodcutter profession was a very vital workforce. Even the VOC started state forests like Tukai Forest, etc. And one was amongst others the Witbome forest, where the VOC government allowed locals, especially from the farming community, to access wood, these state forests, to get free wood for their energy needs of their particular households. However, it has always been problematic because farmers at the time, or local residents, they just didn't go just to state forests, they just any wood that they could find. The result was that the Cape Flats ended up as sandy dunes or as sand dunes because of deforestation, because all the wood that the company or the free burgers could find, they just simply cut off for their household energy needs. So Batchwood and Witbome, the name of Witbome Station, are all reminders of how vital forests, trees and wood played. It went so far when Governor van der Stel retired in Constantia at Groot Constantia, he encouraged everyone to take silver leaf seeds to spread all over the peninsula, just to encourage reforestation of the Cape Peninsula, because deforestation is one of the legacies. The importance of forestry is so important in the history of Cape Town, and also connected to Wynberg by means of the legacy of the Witbome Station and the old Witbome Civic Center or Community Hall, because forestry played a vital role in Cape Town, and the VOC excessive use of the search for firewood resulted in deforestation, but also at the same time the VOC already started very early with state forests. Remember, they started with Hout Bay as a forest to supply wood to the city or to the town, to Kaapstad, and to the passing fleets. So forest in Wynberg, and not just wine farms, but forestry was also equally important during the Dutch VOC period, and later with the British expanding on state forest across the colony.